Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We've gotten more and more requests from listeners that are interested in if there's some way that they can contribute back to the show. And while we're not really planning on doing a Patreon or anything like that, there is something you could do that would be a huge help to making the show better for you and your fellow listeners. As you might know, for every episode, we have really detailed show notes that include both timestamps for relevant topic changes, as well as a page that lists every single card that we mentioned throughout the episode to try and make it easier and more accessible to follow along with what we're talking about. Some of our earlier episodes don't have this metadata though, so if you'd like to help us out by listening to an old episode, keeping track of both the relevant topic changes for timestamps, as well as the cards we mentioned throughout the episode, to annotate these for future listeners, that would be a huge help to us. If you're interested in helping us out, there's a link in the show notes to a page that includes a template that you can fill out as you're following along with the episode, as well as other information about what exactly we need, my contact information so you can claim an episode so we're not doing redundant work, and we really appreciate you helping us out and also just being a listener to the show. This podcast has been a lot of fun and just something that we appreciate contributing back to the community, so we appreciate you all for being a part of it.
I'm not able to fetch my lands, someone's about to catch these hands. It's Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Pack one, pick one, foil Scalding Tarn, force blue-red Maddox.
I maintain I did not force blue-red in this wacky draft you're referencing. I felt like it was a good lane to be in. If I'm honest, my first 5-6 picks, I was in all kinds of colors. I was trying to figure out what lane was the most open. I think I did an okay job.
I trust you. It's just fun to imagine.
Do I trust myself? Not really.
It's just fun to imagine that you opened that Scalding Tarn and you're like, I gotta do it. I have to play exactly blue-red. Your nickname is appropriate, Anthony, because this week on the show, we are talking all about fetch lands. We are doing our occasional deep dive on a particular subject. You may remember we did an entire episode about Brainstorm a couple months ago. We sometimes like to go really deep on a specific card or card type. And this week, it's fetch lands. So we're going to talk about everything about fetch lands that we can think to discuss, which will not just pertain to Cube, but will pertain to all kinds of Magic and all kinds of fetch lands. So do you have a lot of thoughts about fetch lands, Anthony?
I have a lot of thoughts about fetch lands.
That's a little teaser, so everyone stays tuned for the rest of the episode. Before we get into our main discussion, we have a pack one, pick one from a listener-submitted cube. This cube, Anthony, is about lands, but it doesn't actually include any fetch lands, so it's up in the air whether it's actually on theme for this week's episode. This is Bones' Amonkar Desert Cube. Amonkar being a... What's the word for putting two words together into one word? Thank you. Amonkar being a portmanteau of Amonkhet and Zendikar, because the themes of this cube are based around a lot of the themes that are present in both of these sets. And for those of you who don't know what a desert cube is, a desert cube is a cube where you are forced to draft all your lands. You have no access to a basic land box at the end of the draft, so whatever you get in the draft is what you get to play with. Have you ever played a desert cube, Anthony?
I have not. I've seen a lot of them. I think it's really interesting that, you have this idea of you have to draft your lands because there's no box of basics you can pull from. You have to draft everything, which is really interesting from like a signaling perspective to try and figure out what's open. It's like, oh, there's all these great blue cards, but I haven't seen an island in 8 packs. Maybe something's not going well. It's funny, though, that a lot of them also have a theme of deserts, of lands that have the desert type, which is flavorful. It's kind of cool. Even though, like, mechanically, I don't know how much these two things really fit together.
I mean, they're non-basic lands that care about lands.
True.
The draft cares about lands, too. I think it makes sense. We get a little bit of a bigger pack here. Instead of drafting 3 packs of 15, we draft 3 packs of 18. So we get a little bit bigger pool, more chance to get our lands. I have to say, Anthony, I've never played a Desert Cube either, and I have no idea how highly I'm supposed to value lands relative to other spells in this environment.
Right, that's the big question, right?
I presume higher than average, but then also maybe in most Desert Cubes, the last few picks, you're always just kind of picking up some lands, and even an off-color land can basically be a waste. So I feel like, maybe you're not that likely to not have enough lands to play your deck. And I feel like going into pack 3, you could prioritize them more if you didn't get enough in the first 2 packs. I don't really know. So our relative inexperience should inform this pack one, pick one, and maybe you should take what we say with a big, giant grain of salt. With that said, let's dive into the pack. Again, 18-card pack. It's a pretty big pack, so if you want to see these cards, you can check out the visual spoiler for this episode, and you can do that by going to luckypaper.co/podcast/97/cards. That's kind of a mouthful. You can also check the show notes. There we have a visual spoiler of not just all the cards in the Pack 1 Pick 1, but also through the entire episode that we may bring up in conversation. The pack is Ghost Town, Survivors Encampment, Desert of the Mindful, Hall of Oracles, Desert, Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, Cleric Class, Deem Worthy, Old Rutstein, Hunger of the Howl Pack, Mountain, Break Ties, Soaring Sea Cliff, Ickerslick, Looming Spires, Crypt Breaker, Zagoth Triome, and Island. A lot of options, Anthony. What are you drawn to?
I'm looking at this in two ways. One is we got a bunch of lands. What are the lands that are most relevant? The other is what are the most powerful cards, and is the next best non-land card in the pack actually worth taking over a land? And that, again, is the biggest place where we don't necessarily have the context to really fine-tune what that answer is, but let's think about both of those. I think in terms of lands, this is a pretty easy Zagoth Triome for me. This is a powerful card, on its own. It has cycling, which is really relevant. It fixes for a bunch of colors. And I'm even much more excited about that in this context early in the draft because I'm going to need lands that make my colors. And so just being a more open pick, normally I would say, I might not want this unless I'm at least two of these colors. But now saying this is a land that as long as I'm any one of these three colors is like
it's one of your 16 lands you're going to play or whatever.
So I think that's where I am in terms of lands. As far as the non-land cards, I just love Crypt Breaker. It's cheap, it's effective, it does a lot of stuff. There are some other powerful cards here, but I'm between those two cards. And I think my gut is taking the Triome as the right choice.
I like looking at the pack and trying to discern what we can learn about the environment from the pack. And it's notable to me here that there are no lands that produce colored mana without jumping through some hoop that come into play untapped, except for basics in this pack. I did glance at the list, and there are some non-basic lands that do produce colored mana that do come in untapped, but it's interesting to think about how much you actually value a basic land in this environment as an untapped colored mana source, which you take for granted in any other non-desert draft format. I'd be curious to know at what point in the pack we're going to take those basic lands. For me, it's not Pack 1 Pick 1. I agree with you. If we're on a land, it's going to be Zagoth Triome. If we're not on a land, I think my next pick is probably Deem Worthy. It's just a decent removal spell. This is the 5 mana, deal 7 to target creature at instant speed, or you can cycle it for 4 and deal 2 damage, cycling so you get to draw a card. That's, I think, the main mode of the card is the 4 mana, shock something, draw a card. And if you have something real big, you have this sort of second mode of 5 mana to kill even really big stuff. And I like both sides of that card quite a bit. So that is probably my next highest pick, I think. But I agree with you. I think it's Zagoth Triome, but I don't think it's particularly close because I don't think Deem Worthy or Crypt Breaker really get that close to a great 3-colored land. And it's worth noting this environment does seem quite a bit slower than a lot of the cubes we play often. I did talk on the most recent episode about how I'm not actually particularly high on the Triomes in power-motivated cubes because the cycling is so often too expensive to really be worth it. Like, it kind of only has pseudo-cycling because you're very often fetching them up, and when you do draw them, cycling 3 is a big cost.
Right, so you're not saying they are not powerful enough. You're saying in that kind of context, they are just less appealing to you from a play patterns perspective.
Yeah, they're undoubtedly powerful as 3-colored lands that you can search up with fetch lands, but because of that play pattern thing, the fact that they're not actually that modal, and also because of my other aesthetic problems with the cards, they're not my favorite. But here, I like it quite a bit. If I put my player hat on, I like it quite a bit here for all the reasons you stated. So I think that's probably the pick. The other card that jumped out at me that I do want to mention is just Ickerslick, and that's because the cycling on Ickerslick is actually all colorless mana. So theoretically, we could play Ickerslick in any deck, which is not true of any of these other cards. We do have a lot of cycling cards in this pack, both lands and non-lands, but they all require some sort of colored mana to cycle them. Ickerslick, you can just cycle for 2 generic mana, and if you are not cycling it, it's quite a good card. I really like Ickerslick in terms of power level. That's another card that jumped out at me, but hard to pass on Zagoth Triome, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, thank you, Bones, for sending in your Amonkar Desert Cube. Everybody should go check out this cube on Cube Cobra because Bones has spent a lot of time on the cube overview. There's custom banner art. There's a custom set symbol. It's clearly a labor of love, and I think it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you are not familiar with desert cubes and want to see what one might look like. If you want us to do a Pack 1 Pick 1 from your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, send a link to your cube on Cube Cobra, and your name and pronouns to mail@luckypaper.co. Fetch lands, Anthony.
Fetch lands.
I want this conversation to be for everybody. I want this to be a big tent conversation. And because of that, I want to start with just defining what fetch lands are for people that maybe are less familiar with them, maybe haven't played with them yet, for whatever reason. What is a fetch land, Anthony?
That's a great question. When you say fetch lands, do you mean the iconic cycle of the 2-color fetch lands that everybody knows from the highest power formats, that are defining cards in Modern and Legacy and Vintage? Or do you want to be a little bit broader and talk about Evolving Wilds and the Panoramas and all these other kinds of variations of just lands that don't make mana themselves necessarily, but go get other lands out of your library with some choice?
I want it to be a Big Ten conversation because I think almost everything we're going to talk about relative to fetch lands applies to all of them, both the really powerful ones, the cycle originally from Onslaught that was then finished in Zendikar, and also the ones that are less powerful, your Evolving Wilds, your Panoramas. The benefits and costs of these things still apply regardless of how efficient the card is, right? And so you can decide on power level which ones are right for your environment, though I would probably make the case that your mana can't be too good for any environment, but that's a whole different conversation. But I think no matter what, all the sort of things we're going to talk about apply to all the fetch lands. There was quite a few of them. It's worth noting they were originally introduced not in Onslaught, but in Mirage, and that's where we got a cycle of fetch lands that all entered the battlefield tapped and then could be tapped and sacrificed to go get a basic land type and put it into play without paying a life. So that's an edge they have over the fetch lands from Onslaught, which were the next fetch lands that were printed. And these ones did definitely become, as you pointed out, the iconic fetch lands most people know of. This is your Polluted Delta, your Flooded Strand, your Wooded Foothills, etc. They have become, like you said, defining in Eternal formats, and they're just some of the most powerful ways to fix your mana in Magic's history. And the reason for that is because of how they interact with lands that have multiple basic land types. We just had Zagoth Triome in our Pack 1 Pick 1. So Zagoth Triome is an island, a swamp, and a forest, which means that any fetch land that can get any one of those land types can get that Zagoth Triome. I remember when I learned this about fetch lands, 6 or 7 years ago or whatever, and it kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, so I can actually, this Polluted Delta is not just a blue-black land. It can be any color land that I need depending on my deck based on what sort of fetchable lands I have to get with it.
Right. Should we actually read a fetch land here?
Yeah, why don't you pick your favorite one and read it off for us?
Oh, well, Windswept Heath is obviously the most powerful one, but I happen to be looking at Scalding Tarn. So it's a land. It has tap, pay a life, sacrifice Scalding Tarn, and search your library for an island or a mountain card and put it into the battlefield. Then shuffle. So it costs you a life. It'll get you either an island or a mountain of your choice that enters untapped in this case with this cycle of fetch lands. And it doesn't say basic. So yeah, like you're saying, you can get any of your shock lands, your bicycle lands, your original dual lands, if you've got those floating around.
Yeah, and then some of the other fetch lands, like the Evolving Wilds and the Terramorphic Expanses of the world, they do get only basic lands. So your Terramorphic Expanse can only get one of your 5 basic land types, not one of the dual lands. And that does come into play tap. So obviously that card is less powerful, but again, the power level is kind of irrelevant here in terms of talking about mechanically what fetch lands actually do. On this show, we're definitely a fan of lands that do things. We've talked about creature lands and how interesting and valuable we think they are in terms of both drafting them and building decks with them and playing games with them and how they actually play out. And there are other lands that do things. We've talked about the lands that have the activated ability to scry or to get some sort of late game card selection and how that can be valuable in a lot of environments. So we're really big champions of lands that do stuff. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so much fun when you're building a cube, when you're playing a cube, to lean into the complexity and the long tail of all the little kinds of interactions and opportunities for decision space. So yeah, having a land that late in the game, if you've run out of cards, can turn into a quick creature or start, like we have these Strixhaven cycle that lets you do a repeated scry and sort of give you a little bit of deck filtering late in the game. Just gives players a lot of choices. And I don't think more choices is always necessarily just good. I'm not saying just make everything as complex as possible, but just making, that other 40% of the cards in your deck also add to interesting decision space is potentially very powerful from a design perspective.
And I'm going to argue, Anthony, that of all the land cycles in all of Magic's history, fetch lands are the lands that do the most things. And I think most people don't realize that. I think they look at creature lands or, these scry lands or something and think, oh, this has got a whole activated ability. This clearly does other stuff. With fetch lands, it's kind of a little bit obscured. It's not right on the surface that it does other stuff. You might just think, okay, this just fixes my mana. But I would argue that they do more. They touch more mechanics in Magic's history. They change more about the environment by their presence than any other lands that have ever been printed.
All right, sell me on that.
Let's talk about all the things that fetch lands do. So again, we're talking about any land now that sacrifices itself to go get a land out of your deck. Whenever you get a land out of your deck or anything out of your deck, you have to shuffle. And shuffling your deck is one of the advantages of fetch lands. I pulled a bunch of examples of cards that care about shuffling. Obviously, we talked about this at length in our Brainstorm episode. You can go check that episode out if you want to hear that conversation. It also works with other Brainstorm-esque abilities like Sensei's Divining Top or Sylvan Library. Those are all cards from my cube, but it also works with cards from your cube, Anthony, like Future Sight, Bulls the Citadel, even stuff like Oust or Dryad Greenseeker. Like, these things can be relevant with the fetch land where you have an opportunity to shuffle. Somebody ousts a creature that you don't want to draw again because it's later in the game now, you don't want to draw that small creature. You might be able to use a fetch land to shuffle your deck to draw something new that's not just the creature that was ousted to the top of the deck.
Yeah, I mean, they're a huge component of some of my commander decks as well. I love playing my mono black commander deck where I have as many fetch lands as I can, specifically because the deck really tries to get Bulls of Citadel in play. And having that opportunity to shuffle the deck when you don't have a relevant spell on top is really powerful. Or in another one of my decks with Oracle of Moldiah and other things that let you play lands off the top and play multiple lands, being able to shuffle and actually hit all those lands is extremely relevant to the game plan.
Yeah, and I think people might think this is a small edge, and certainly it depends on the environment. You could definitely make a cube.
Context really, really matters here.
You could definitely make a cube where this doesn't matter, but I would argue most people, if you haven't thought about this at all, you probably incidentally have quite a few things in your cube, a handful of things that care about this, and it can really matter in some situations, right? Like, it can be the difference between getting to cast a spell for Future Sight this turn, getting to cast 3 spells on a Future Sight this turn, or getting to cast nothing because you hit your second land on top. So it can make a huge difference when it comes up, and I think it's a relevant interaction that no other lands interact with these kinds of cards this way.
Yeah, not to be starting out too negative on this, but in some contexts, those kinds of interactions can be so low volume. Like if you have maybe 2 cards in your whole cube that care about that, you have your Future Sight, you have your Bulls of Citadel, and that's it. It's both cool that you have those really, really tiny edges, but it can also get to the point where if you're trying to play optimally, you're trying to follow these heuristics of when do I use my fetch land or do I play out my other lands just in case that comes up, it can become more taxing than it's actually worth in some cases. So I think the context is really relevant to keep in mind.
I don't think I've ever heard you be critical of those kinds of things because you tend to champion those kinds of long tail effects that have a minimal impact, where you've said in the past that it's the kind of thing that if a new player doesn't think about it, they're not hugely punished, right? Because again, it is kind of a small edge, but you give the experienced players that long tail to possibly get some advantage.
Totally.
Examples we've talked about before is like you have some of the Banishing Priest style cards that have different enters the battlefield and leaves the battlefield abilities on it, so that if something happens to that creature, after its enter the battlefield trigger is on the stack, whatever it exiled stays exiled forever. And you said you explicitly preferred that over Banishing Light. Like, you prefer Oblivioning over Banishing Light because if you have some way to interact with that, that's the long tail kind of stuff that experienced players can really sink their teeth into.
Totally. I think that's actually a good comparison to bring up. I agree creating that long tail is really valuable and something that I really do try and curate. I think there is a specific difference here, and I should say it cuts both ways. It is both potentially a feature or a bug. It really depends on what you're looking for from your environment and, the kind of Magic you like to play. Where I think it is different is that kind of interaction between, Banisher Priest and Flicker Effect matters when you draw those 2 cards at the same time, and you're not necessarily spending a lot of brain power thinking about that the whole game when that doesn't matter. This kind of interaction with fetch lands is like, you have to think about this. If you're trying to play optimally, you have to spend a lot of time thinking about this. Or not a lot of time, a tiny amount of effort thinking about this thing that is, 2% chance to come up way later in the game. So that is the small difference. But again, you're totally right that I agree that it is both a feature or a bug.
I don't think it's that different, honestly, because if you have multiple kinds of removal spells in your hand, then theoretically you should try and hold the Banishing Light until you can do the trick with it. So or not Banishing Light, the Oblivion Ring. So I do think that they're kind of in the same boat. But either way, we'll get more into the potential downsides of fetch lands. I want to run through all the advantages. So again, the first one, shuffling and the benefits that can grant you when you have the ability to shuffle at will, which does come up quite a bit, I would argue, in Magic. Next one, a little more simple, allows you to trigger Revolt at will. You can just make sure a permanent left the battlefield on any turn you want to in order to cast cards with Revolt, such as Fatal Push. I think the biggest thing for fetch lands in my environment is that they fuel Graveyard Matter synergies like Delirium, Delve, Threshold, anything that cares about having cards in your graveyard or card types in your graveyard, being able to, if you have a sufficient density of fetch lands, basically draft a deck where you can rely on, by turn 2 or 3, on having a land in your graveyard, really changes how you evaluate these kinds of effects. I think Treasure Cruise or Gurmag Angler or Choose Your Delve Spell of Choice gets way better in an environment where you have access to a lot of fetch lands and can guarantee that the cost of that card is going to be low, even at early stages of the game.
Yeah, and it is cool that, again, talking about like lands that do stuff, when you're drafting and putting your deck together, saying you want to prioritize these fetch lands, not just because they're powerful and they fix your mana, but potentially even if your mana is already good enough, you really want to favor them because you know you're trying to build around these other kinds of effects.
Yeah, for example, I think if you're drafting mono red in my cube and you end up with a Dragon's Rage Channeler and an Unholy Heat,
right,
I would prioritize fetch lands quite highly, even in a mono red deck where I'm not getting any mana fixing benefit from having those fetch lands because they're good enough in those situations. Let's also throw a Magmatic Sinkhole in there too, right? Now you've got 3 cards that really care about it, and there I would actually start prioritizing fetch lands quite highly because they have synergy with all these other cards. Probably your favorite thing about fetch lands, if I had to guess, Anthony, is you get to double trigger landfall and also get landfall triggers at instant speed, which is kind of rare to do, and so sometimes that can lead to very interesting board states and decisions.
Landfall is such a cool mechanic. It's fun to trigger landfall a bunch of times.
You were triggering landfall a bunch of times in our Commander game last night.
Yeah, that's great. I love to do it. Triggering landfall and also Titania. What a great card.
Yeah. One of the more simple advantages is that it does allow you to see what your opponent does on their turn before you decide what land to fetch if you don't need to use that land at sorcery speed on your own turn. Or even if you have a tapped land coming into play with like an Evolving Wilds. You know, let's say you have a removal spell and a threat in your hand and you don't have the mana to cast both. And so with your Evolving Wilds, you can, based on whether or not your opponent plays a threat on their turn, decide what you fetch, which means you're kind of like going back in time and deciding what land you played on your turn when you can play lands normally during your own main phase, and deciding which one you actually wanted to play in that moment, which I think is quite powerful. This is another part of fetch lands people oftentimes complain about because, again, it's optimal. You should very often wait until your opponent's end step to actually crack your fetch lands, but that also means that now you weren't spending your opponent's turn while they were thinking and making plays, shuffling your deck. Now, after their turn is over, now you have to shuffle your deck and do the whole searching. So that also comes up as a downside for some people I know.
Similar to that, would you also call it an upside just that you get to obscure a little bit of information from your opponent? You know, it's turn 1 in a constructed tournament. You play your fetch land. They don't actually know what you're doing for that turn because you're not actually fetching. Like, you could get any of the 5 colors with one of your fetch lands. So it's a little bit of a mystery.
That is true. And it's worth noting it doesn't have to be just one turn. If let's say you're playing a control deck that, you know, the first thing it's going to do is counter some spells. If you have tap lands that bring your lands into play untapped, you could just keep them around and not fetch them until the moment you need them. So you could be on turn 3 with 3 fetch lands in play. Your opponent plays the first thing you want to counter. Then you can go get the lands to actually cast your spell. So you can sometimes hold out for a while and keep that mystery alive a little bit.
Right.
The last advantage I have of fetch lands, Anthony, I think is going to be a little more in-depth conversation because this one is quite contested. And this is that fetch lands thin your deck. The concept here is that if you have played a land, sacrificed it, and gone and gotten another land out of your deck, the remaining cards you're going to draw from, now that deck has a slightly higher density of non-land cards. So as you go into the late game and you've cracked 2 or 3 fetch lands or whatever, your deck is essentially more dense with non-land cards than it would be otherwise. And in the late game, you very often do not want to draw more lands. And so this is seen as an advantage by some players. Before I tell you what I think, do you believe in the value of thinning with fetch lands, Anthony?
It's a great question. I mean, there's no believe or disbelieve. It is a fact. It does do this. It does it to a small degree, and we can do the math and figure out what that is. The question is just, is it worth it? Is it worth one life? And is it worth my time to be spending all this time cracking fetch lands when I could just be getting the game over with sooner and playing the next game of Magic?
Yeah, Frank Carson has written a really in-depth article, I think multiple articles when new fetch lands are printed about this exact feature. And in the article, Anthony, he basically, looking at some other pre-existing cards, decides that drawing a card is worth like 4 life in Magic. And by that logic...
Was he just reading Sylvan Library?
I mean, that's one of the cards I think he references. But, you know, he's basically trying to figure out like what the exchange rate between life and cards is. And it ends up being about 4 according to his reckoning. And then he does the math to figure out how many more non-land cards you're likely to draw over the course of the game. And by his math, if you want that one life to be worth a quarter of a card, it's not in basically any format.
Wow, that's a cool way to think about it.
Yeah, you are not, if that's how you break down the math and you value a card at 4 life, then the one life is not in fact worth it. And
so you're specifically talking about quote unquote the fetch lands, not like Evolving Wilds or other lands that don't come with that life cost.
Yeah, in this case, we're talking about the fetch lands that cost a life to tap and sacrifice, the iconic cycle from Onslaught and then Zendikar.
We could throw in a Prismatic Vista in that group too.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think the most recent version of his article was specifically written when Prismatic Vista was printed, because now decks had access to more fetch lands theoretically, and it was like, do you want to run this? How valuable is the thinning? So because Frank has done this math, and at the end of the day, he points to very, very small increases in drawn cards that are not lands. Most of the math I've seen him do is for constructed decks, which are 60 cards, and it is worth noting that this is, I think, substantially more pronounced of an effect in 40-card decks. If the smaller your deck is, the larger percentage of your remaining lands you are getting out of the deck by cracking a single fetch land. So I think that if you're playing Cube or Limited, it does have a much bigger effect there. I'm a believer in the deck thinning, and I believe it's worth the one life in most decks. So I will play. I mean, I don't think it's even possible in my Cube anymore to draft a deck that does not care about any other aspect of the fetch lands, anything we've already talked about. There are so many cards that touch caring about shuffling, caring about graveyard matters, caring about revolt, caring about landfall. There's so many cards that care about these things in my Cube that I'm not even sure you could draft a deck that didn't care about it. But even if you could, especially if I'm aggressive, really only if I'm aggressive, I will definitely say, yeah, it's worth a life for me to thin my deck a bit. And the way I think about it is, I think most players would agree it's a pretty significant decision to play 16 lands or 15 lands, right? Like that, it makes a difference. People care about that decision. It's not so trivial that it doesn't matter. Would you agree?
Yes.
What you're basically doing by cracking a fetch land is drawing from a remaining deck that is as if you started with one less land, right? The deck you would have left if you started with 15 lands instead of 16 lands is what you're now drawing from. So, we're talking about small margins, but it's also small margins to decide how much more often you get mana screwed with 15 lands than 16 lands. Like, that's a small margin decision people value quite highly and would say, I wouldn't play this many lands or I would play that many lands. I think it's the same thing happening here with cracking fetch lands. So, in 40-card decks, in Cube environments, I value that. I think the thinning is valuable. It's admittedly a small edge, but again, it's a small edge. It's kind of invisible, and when it comes up, when you do draw more non-land cards and get to cast more spells, that can turn the tide of a game. So I think it matters.
So I tend to fall in that line as well, but it definitely motivated by the fact that there are just a lot of other reasons to play them in a lot of contexts. So as long as it's like, well, here's a marginal upside, and the thinning is the last marginal upside, sure, that kind of pushes me over the edge. Right. If it was literally, I could look at my whole deck and say, nothing else cares about this, I don't think I would play it without anything else, just for the thinning.
I would if I was aggressive. I would not if I was a control deck. If I was a mid-range deck, I'm not sure. I'd probably side in or out based on the matchup. Mostly, like, if I think my life total is going to be the deciding factor of the game rather than my opponent's life total, then I don't want it, because I think the life is actually a real cost there. So in a control deck, I agree. I don't think it's worth it. Also, control decks tend to have more ability in the late game to have card selection, filter their draws, find what they need. Aggressive decks tend not to, right? They're, by definition, putting pressure on your opponent, which very oftentimes means not playing a lot of dirtily card selection spells. And so that's the sort of confluence of factors that will lead me to value that even in a vacuum with no other synergy in an aggressive deck.
Now, if we talk about not the cost of one life, but the cost of one mana, I would definitely not put in Evolving Wilds. Imagine there was an Evolving I'm playing a monocolored deck. I'm not going to put in Evolving Wilds for the just the thinning there.
Yeah, I mean, a tap land is a huge cost. I would need a fair bit of like landfall synergy or something like that before I would consider playing an Evolving Wilds in a monocolored deck.
Right.
It would be a pretty steep cost. Can you think of any other advantages from the player perspective, Anthony, that we haven't touched on about fetch lands?
I mean, there are a lot of other mechanics, just like there's 2,000...
There's a ton of Graveyard Matters mechanics.
There are 20,000 magic cards. There's going to be a bunch of little things that care about when things get sacrificed, care about how many permanents are in play, cracking your fetch lands, and then with that on the stack, casting Tithe is a cool little interaction.
You love to do it.
And even, single cards that just let you buy back cards from the graveyard, like Crucible of Worlds.
Even casting like your Titania. Eternal Witness to get a land, if you need a land, is a pretty amazing upside, which you can't do without fetch lands.
Sun Titan works well with lands. So there is just a huge long tail of individual cards that just will interact with lands in the graveyard.
Did we cover the mana fixing advantage in-depth enough.
Not really.
I mean, we talked about it a little bit in passing, but that is, again, I think the main virtue. Like all those other things we mentioned are the stuff that fetch lands do. I said they're lands that do a lot of stuff, and that's all of those things mechanically. They also are pretty excellent at fixing your mana. The iconic cycle is extremely excellent at fixing your mana, and even the lesser ones are still really good because they give you, again, the choice of what land you want at whatever part of the game you're in. What more can we say about how good it makes? I mean, I guess a way to think about it is, we'll talk more about this from a cube design perspective, but being able to turn these fetch lands into whatever lands your deck needs is a really powerful effect, right? Being able to have essentially 12 copies of your Volcanic Island in your deck because you have the 4 Volcanic Islands and 8 fetch lands to get them. You only get to play 4 Volcanic Islands. You don't get to play 12. But with fetch lands, you kind of get to play 12. Some of them just cost a life, but that life also trades for all these other advantages we talked about. So it's really powerful from a mana fixing perspective to be able to get whatever land you need.
Right. And I mean, we could talk about in different contexts, they are going to work differently. If you don't have dual lands that have types, they're still reasonable. They're just 2-colored lands that can fetch either of your basics. That works fine. It's obviously very powerful once you can actually fetch all 5 colors. Basically, every single one of your fetches has a potential to be a 5-color land. In lower powered environments, potentially where you're playing in Evolving Wilds, I feel like that's still just an awesome Magic card because, again, if you're playing a two-color deck with a splash, it'll get both of your main colors if that's what you need, but it makes it really easy to just... I love those mana bases where you throw in the one extra basic of some other type and you then have your couple of fetch lands, your couple ways to make it work, and all of a sudden you have 6 or 7 sources from your one basic. I think that's a really fun aspect of deck building.
And we mentioned that they're flexible. You can even fix for green-white with a Polluted Delta, right? If you have a Breeding Pool and a Godless Shrine, you can now use your Polluted Delta to fix for green and white mana. So they are truly extremely flexible. Any fetch land can be used to fix for any combination of mana if you have the appropriate fetchable non-basics to pair with it. This is made a lot easier with Triumphs. With Triumphs, you can just do it kind of in one shot, but that's even true before we had Triumphs. Let's talk about what fetch lands do to a drafted environment, specifically in the context of Cube, because this is what we talk about the most, and this has actually been a topic that's been bouncing around the Cube community a bit lately. A listener to the show, Agile Drunk, did a post on Cube Cobra that goes pretty in-depth, making the argument for breaking Singleton on fetch lands to play even more because they're so valuable. Reddit user Sloth Romp posted a kind of a counterpoint to that article about the reasons why they choose not to run fetch lands in their cube. And we'll get into the downsides, I think, later on, because they're definitely worth talking about. But I think it's a really hot topic because fetch lands do have a very pronounced effect on an environment. Let's talk about mana fixing, Anthony, because I think one of the biggest advantages of fetch lands and the things that a lot of cube designers point to as a reason for running fetch lands is that they are really open picks that are mana fixing lands that are not just City of Brasses or other 5-colored lands. You can first pick a Scalding Tarn, and like you said, you're not committing to blue-red. You could play any combination of blue, any combination of red, or even if you get the right dual lands and an environment has those dual lands, you could play a non-blue-red deck and still use that Scalding Tarn to fix your mana, which means that you can take a fetch land early in the draft and not have it be a super narrow pick. We've talked in our listener-submitted Pack 1 Pick Ones quite a bit about how both you and I don't like taking straight-up dual lands Pack 1 Pick 1. Because even if a Volcanic Island is a really good card, it's like, I need to be playing blue and red for this card to do anything for me. Again, unless I combine it with some other weird fetch lands. But, that's a much more committal pick than just taking a fetch land early.
Right. It's actually more like looking at a gold card versus a hybrid card. The fetch land is going to be relevant if I'm playing blue or red, and presumably in this environment I can get 2-color lands to fetch with it. Whereas, the 2-color land itself is only going to make sense if you're playing both of those colors.
And I think it'd be way different if you just imagined a land that could tap for any of the 5 colors of mana, right? That would be an open pick, but the impact that would have on deck building would be just free splashes. There'd be no sort of constraint placed upon that. The fetch land is an open pick, but requires you to still then draft the supporting non-basic lands to fetch in order to make it valuable. So you still have to spend more draft picks to turn that land into one that actually works for you.
Right, assuming you're not just fetching basics, which most of them do as well.
Yes, you can also just do that, of course. For the purposes of, I think, this mana fixing, let's focus on fetch lands in combination with non-basics that have basic land types.
Let's do it.
The other important thing to remember here, and friend of the show, Jason Waddell, has made a video about this, which I think is very enlightening, is that I think people worry that putting a lot of fetch lands in their cube is going to support many colored decks, the dreaded 5-color good stuff, if you're someone that dreads 5-color good stuff. And it's very important, I think, to realize that if you added more 5-color lands, more City of Brasses or whatever, I think that would be true, right? You would be adding more free mana fixing to cast spells of any color, and it would be easier for decks to, with only a few draft picks, have a really solid mana base that can cast any of the spells they draw or draft. With fetch lands, though, adding fetch lands to an environment, I think, offsets an inherent bias that comes with running a bunch of dual lands, a bunch of non-basics, which actually favors the many-colored decks. There's a couple ways you can look at this to try and understand it better. So, for example, a 2-color deck can only play one dual land, right? If you imagine a full cycle of dual lands, your 2-color deck can only play one of them, right? If you're a green-white deck, you can only play the green-white dual land. You won't play any other dual lands. So you're only playing one of that 10-card cycle. A 3-color deck can play 3 of those dual lands, all the different combinations of their 3 colors. And a 4-color deck can play 6, and obviously a 5-color deck can play all 10 of them. And so if you imagine a cube where all of the non-basic lands are just duals, then they can be duals of any kind, right? They can be Guild Gates, they could be original duals, they can be whatever, but they're not fetch lands. They only produce 2 colors of mana. The more colors your deck is, the more lands you have an opportunity to draft. So it is easier for the 3 and 4 color decks to find more lands because they have more lands available to them. With fetch lands, this is kind of flipped on its head a little bit, and I think for the better in terms of supporting even distributions of available mana at every different kind of combination of colors of decks. So let's take another example. This example is really similar to one that Admiral Drunk gave in their article on Cube Cobra, and I actually independently had written basically the same thing. Let's just imagine you have a cube that has 50 fixing lands, because it's easier to work with round numbers. We can first imagine a version of this cube that has, again, only dual lands. So imagine you've got 50 lands, you've got 5 of each dual land in the cube. If you're a 2-color deck, again, you've only got 5 lands in the whole cube that you can draft for your deck. The other 45 are irrelevant to you. You're never going to touch them. If you swap out one of those cycles of dual lands for a cycle of fetch lands, the 10 fetch lands from Onslaught and Zendikar, now your 2-color deck has 11 lands in the cube that it could possibly play. It has the 4 dual lands that are left. We subtracted 1 to swap it out for a fetch land, and 7 of the fetch lands that can get one of those 4 dual lands. So we jump from 5 available lands to 11 available lands in our 2-color deck. If we go to 2 sets of fetch lands like I play in my environment, we get to 17 lands we can play in our 2-color deck in this cube. So this means that there's no longer this bias in terms of the amount of available lands in the cube that a deck can play. 3-color decks can play a few more lands, right, than a 2-color deck. It's still in these numbers, but the extreme variation has been narrowed. And with a lot of fetch lands, you can actually have very, very good 2-color mana bases, which I think a lot of people think it naturally leads to many-colored mana bases, but I actually think it happens a lot more with just regular dual land fixing, because if there's nothing else in the pack, you'll take a dual land that's in one half of your colors, and then now you have a free splash without having to think about it at all. And if you're planning to play a 3 or 4 color deck, you're not competing against the 2-color decks for all those other lands, because they can only play a small subset of them. So adding fetch lands adds these flexible, high-value lands that any deck that is more than 1 color will play. And again, in some cases, some decks that are 1 color will even play, which I think really evens the playing field in a nice way. Does that make sense? Those two ways to look at this problem?
So I don't know if I'm totally convinced by your argument, largely because many color decks still can play a fetch land as, okay, maybe this fetches my dual that is in my base colors, but then it can also fetch something else. So it still does help. It still effectively is a dual land at the same time as it is this hybrid flexible thing.
It's not that it's worse for the 3-color decks at all. I mean, it's still better fixing than dual lands are. It's that now you're not going to get as many of them because you're competing with way more decks for the same fixing lands.
Right. The other thing I'm a little bit skeptical about is you're saying, okay, there are more lands that any individual deck can play, any individual 2-color deck can play, but you're still competing with everybody else, so you're not actually, unless you're actually increasing the fraction of lands in the environment, everybody still has the theoretical access to the same number of actual lands that'll make it to the deck. I think the last part you said is starting to compel me, where you're saying it really is about not how many lands there are, but the level of competition. And if it's that, some color pair is underdrafted, so that's just going to wheel. I've definitely felt that without, fetches and duels in environments that just have a lot of unfetchable dual lands, your Guild Gates, whatever. The lands often will go later because they are only wanted by very specific players. So if it, happens to be early in a pack with a key card, player might pass it, and you're just more likely to be able to vacuum those up as the 5-player drafter later in the draft.
Yeah, that's the other thing I'll say is that you're right. Obviously, if you have 50 lands in the environment and you do a draft and use the whole cube, they're all going to be in players' pools. I've played lots of environments where there are no fetch lands, and I find that I very often get, second to last or last pick, just a land that's off color that, didn't line up with how the draft was going, right? The player that was
anecdotally, that's been my experience as well.
Right. The player that was in that color pair, like they had to take this like bomb or whatever over this dual land, and they had to pass it, and then no one else wanted it, and it just ended up at my seat because it ended up that way. I very, very rarely end up not main decking a land in a cube like mine. It just almost never happens. Because, again, of this sort of flexibility of fetch lands, which are the ones I'm picking highly, I'm not usually taking dual lands until I already know kind of what colors I am, because I don't take them speculatively. And then I'm also not getting them late because everyone wants their lands. Everyone wants good mana, so I'm not getting a last pick shock land or fetch land. So it just rarely happens that I have a unplayable land left in my sideboard. So I think it's a way to make it so 3 and 4 color decks have to fight more with 2 color decks for fixing lands, which I think actually has the overall effect of decreasing the prevalence of many color decks. And it's also a way to make sure more of the lands see play because they're more flexible picks, so more likely they're going to end up in someone's pool and get played rather than be riding a sideboard.
I see your point there. I do think that this is something that really would depend based on the actual players and the playgroup that you're talking about, because
it always does, yeah.
Ultimately, the question is not what is the time-traveling supercomputer going to do and say, like, is a 5-color good stuff actually better in this environment now that there's fetches? It really comes down to player perception, and if players are like, oh, there's fetches in here, I can now play my 5-color deck, and everybody agrees they're going to do it, people are going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it really does come down to that, right? And there's people that play 5-color good stuff in retail limited, where you have like 2 fixing lands you have access to, basically. They'll still do it. So you can't stop them from doing what they're going to do. But I do think that what ends up coming out of any given draft is a confluence of the environment and the constraints that it puts on players and the players and all of their accumulated history and experience playing Magic and what they bring to the table. And those two things have they're both vying for what the actual result of the draft is. And I'm not sure what the exact influence is of one over the other, and probably changes from day to day and draft to draft. It's also worth noting that I think you get a lot of the benefits of this in your cube, even though you don't play the classic iconic fetch lands, with your choice to run many copies of Prismatic Vista. Prismatic Vista, to me, is a great example of a land that is a flexible pick, but it's not a City of Brass. You can't just play any color of mana because you have to have the cost of putting a basic of that color in your deck to play it. So right. Prismatic Vista, not that great in a 5-color deck, honestly. It's a much better mana fixer in a 2-color deck. And so even though you don't have this back and forth with the fetch lands and the duels that can go fetch, I think playing many copies of Prismatic Vista, it has a very similar impact on the overall mana base and how the draft plays out.
Right. There's another aspect to it, which is that distinguishes it from a City of Brass type effect, where it's a risk that you have to put that one basic in. So if you want to splash, you're also sometimes going to draw that splash land when you don't need it in your opening hand with 2 lands and kind of get stuck. It also means you have to make the choice when you play it. So if it's turn 1, you're making that choice. You can't just say, oh, this is fixing me forever. I now have all my mana for the rest of the game.
There's a big difference in and this comes up too, when people are calculating mana bases, I do the same thing, but you look at all your fetch lands and say, okay, these are all, black, red, and blue sources because I have the dual lands to go get with them or whatever. But importantly, once you've cracked one, even if you have dual lands, it's only become 2 of those sources, right? Even though my fetch land was a source of 3 mana sources in terms of how I was looking at my mana base, it's only ever going to get 2, at least in my environment where I don't have triumphs. And so you could still get to turn 3 and have drawn a blue mana source, but not have blue mana in play because you had to get your Blood Crypt to play whatever you were going to play in sequencing. That's even more pronounced with the Prismatic Vista, right? Like, you're counting it as a source of your splash color, but on turn 1, if you're like, don't have your splash card in your hand, and you just need to get color B when you already have color A's basic in your hand, you're just going to do it. And then you have drawn your source, your mana source for your splash color, but it didn't actually give you your splash color in that circumstance.
Right.
I think that's really I think that and everything we talked about from a player perspective in terms of whether you want your lands to affect the archetypes and themes in your cube. If you have a landfall theme in your cube, right? I mean, that's why fetch lands were printed in Zendikar and Onslaught, right? Onslaught had Threshold and Zendikar had Landfall. And so the fetch lands came in sets that had themes that cared about them. So between all those themes we mentioned, all this other advantages of fetch lands and the way they actually play out in a draft, those are the big considerations, I think, when you're deciding whether or not to put fetch lands in your cube. Is there any other advantages to fetch lands from a cube design perspective that we haven't touched on?
A small thing from a design perspective is they are powerful and people are excited about them and want to play with them. So if you're trying to encourage people to play your cube, saying, I've got these powerful lands, might make them a little bit more excited.
Again, yeah, I think, yes, that is true.
I don't know. I don't think that's a good thing. I want people to play my cube that's not full of fetch lands.
A lot of the mechanical stuff we talked about could be true if you're just playing a bunch of Evolving Wilds, right? That could still be part of the decisions, and that's not a historically powerful land that's going to draw people in. Hey, you want to hold an Evolving Wilds?
Hell yeah, I do.
There's that one really beautiful promo that I love so much. It's great. Let's segue into the downsides of fetch lands, Anthony, because they do have somewhat substantial downsides, and some players choose to avoid them for those reasons. I think it's important to run through what all of those downsides are.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked a lot about why we love fetch lands, but overall, I also don't love fetch lands.
I will say that I love them.
Unequivocally.
I would play a fetch and fetchable mana base in any cube I designed, basically, that could support it. I couldn't do it in the Degenerate Micro Cubes. The decks were so small, it didn't make any sense. But I really love what they do to the draft. I love everything about them. So everything we've talked about, all of those advantages, I love basically every single one of those things we went through. And I love lands that do stuff. So I'm kind of an unequivocal champion of fetch lands. But there are downsides. I think the biggest one, Anthony, for sure, if you're playing in paper, is that it is time-consuming to shuffle your deck n number of times, where n is the number of fetch lands you have drawn this game.
It is significant. I think people overlook it, but yeah, you're spending a lot of time shuffling your deck, and I think that is a real downside.
It is. It absolutely is. There's a couple of things I think to mention here. One thing is that I've noticed a lot of players, I think, shuffle way too much.
Yes, that is true.
They just they get into a habit of
I'm sure I do this often as well.
They're I'm sure I've done it as well. And so, if I'm just thinking about something or mindlessly doing it, but I think players get into a habit of thinking, oh yeah, I shuffle for 30 seconds. You don't need to do that. So if you're trying to play quickly with fetch lands, I would argue that you can get around this. But the important thing about designing a cube, if you're playing a cube, is that you don't have control of what your players are doing. So even if you're playing quickly, you might have a player in your play group that's not, and that's going to slow down the whole pod if they are taking forever to shuffle their deck. It also sometimes in bigger decks, I think this is less pronounced in 40-card decks, in bigger decks it can be time-consuming to find the card you're trying to fetch up, because if you only have the 4 Volcanic Islands, it's not like you're going to find one in the first 3 cards of your library, like if you cracked an Evolving Wilds or looking for a basic. Finding that card in the deck could be also time-consuming, especially if it comes up in Commander, right? In Commander, you very often have your one fetch land that fetches your one dual land in your 100-card deck, and it's all right, well, I'm just going to do this because it's going to take forever. Which is another thing to bring up here. I think very oftentimes players should value the time savings over the heuristic of saving the fetch land until the end step. I try oftentimes to play with a kind of house rule that if you want to crack your fetch land now, great. And if what I do on my turn really changes your decision, then you can go back and undo it, right? But if you're 90% to get this fetch land, just do it on your turn. And if you want to change it later, whatever. Obviously, if you're playing any kind of formal Magic, that's not going to be okay, but I think it's fine for casual Magic, and it does speed up games a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that really, you take all of this, the fact that it is optimal to crack your fetch lands at the end step, it takes time to find the land, it takes time to shuffle, it really just makes games take so much longer. I love to play Magic. I'd like to play more Magic.
I think that's the biggest downside by far. To me, the second biggest downside, which is very real as well, is that they're complex, and some people don't think that the mana is the fun part of Magic, and they don't want to think about it. I don't want to have to think about my lands. I just want to cast my spells. My spells are what I am interested in Magic for. And I think that's a totally valid way to approach the game. It's not how I feel. I like thinking about my mana, but if you don't want complex decisions related to the ability to cast your spells, then fetch lands are probably not for you, because they do cause a lot of decisions. Even basic fetch lands like your Evolving Wilds, right? New players have to learn this land comes into play tap, so I should play this one early, or play this one on a turn where I have nothing to do with this land, and learning which color to fetch up based on what's in your hand and what you're likely to draw. Even simple fetch lands are still pretty complicated, and certainly when you go down the deep hole of your polluted Delta can fix in your green-white deck or whatever, it gets really complex.
It really does, and I actually see, again, we can basically say every positive thing we talked about in the first half, we can just say that's also a negative, because sometimes you don't want that. And I think
everything is everything.
This is a big one where this can very easily become a negative, especially to me in the really detailed interactions, like remembering which dual lands you have. So if you have, a complicated 3 or 4 color deck and you're thinking, okay, well, when I crack this fetch, I need to make sure I get this particular dual so that this other fetch land I have in my hand can then still fetch this other color. And it's really easy to fail to keep track of those, or just fail to understand them, or make just stupid mistakes and then put yourself into situations where you just can't sequence your game the way you thought you could.
Yep.
And those are frustrating and not fun, I think, for a lot of people. I think that, again, for many people, saying that is the nuance, that is like the edge that they want to have mastery over this game. But for many, it's also just, that's frustrating and boring, and I want to get to casting my dragons, and that's totally reasonable.
That last example you gave of having like a 3 or 4 color deck or a 5 color deck, and this really complicated combination of like, I've got 7 fetch lands and 8 fetchables, and I'm trying to figure out how this works. That is the one thing that actually frustrates me, even though I love fetch lands.
Especially when
I have made that mistake where it's like, oh crap, this did fetch 3 blue lands, but I've actually already fetched up all 3 of those blue lands or whatever, and now it fetches nothing, or
oh yeah, I mean that's the worst case when you're like, oh crack, fail to find, I don't actually have another source of this can fetch, and that's when people are
going to catch those hands. Exactly. So that one really gets me, and that even I, who love fetch lands, that has come up for me, and it is hugely frustrating. It's like, oh, so I guess to play optimally, I'm supposed to like take a picture of my fetchables before the game begins, and like you said, think about it very intentionally at every step. Like, okay, I want to make sure I can still fetch an untapped green land because I have this double pip green spell in my deck I might draw. It's a lot.
And it also, weirdly, I feel like that can be frustrating when you actually have more agency. If you just are drawing your hand, it's like, oh, I didn't draw 2 forests, I can't cast this double pip spell. That's kind of fine. You lost to the randomness. That can maybe not feel so bad. But if you actively made the decision, oh, I could have gotten my second green source, but I thought, I'll get this black source instead, that can feel really frustrating too.
The other thing I want to mention here is that, again, I love fetch lands, but it's important to remember, if we're talking about a cube, you're not the only one to play your cube. And it's a fact of my cube with double fetch lands.
That's a really, really important thing that I think we should say more often.
It is. I mean, my cube has 2 sets of fetch lands, and in addition to that, it's got a prismatic vista and like other stuff going on. It's got a lot of fetching lands, and it has happened that a player who is not that new to Magic but doesn't play Eternal Constructed, right? They play on Arena or whatever, drafted my cube, drafted a mana base, and then I got to the end of all the rounds, and they handed me their deck and their sideboard, and their fetch lands are in their sideboard because they didn't understand how it worked, right? They've got their Misty Rainforest. They didn't put it in their Grixis deck because they didn't realize it could fetch up Watery Grave. And that's a real cost that, even though I love fetch lands, I have to acknowledge, right? It is a thing about my cube that is just a way that it functions, that if you are not a player who is willing to at least engage with that complexity, your performance is going to suffer.
Right. I think that is sort of part of a class of knowledge that is very unlikely to be discovered. Like, those are the most fun interactions when you're actually in a draft. You're like, oh, I have card A, and it works with card B, and I'm going to put these together, and that's going to be exciting. I don't think I've ever seen a player, like, have that epiphany looking at a dual land and a fetch land during a draft. So,
I think you're right, and I don't think it's because it's inherently less discoverable. I think it's people don't look at lands. When you're looking at your deck, you're looking at your non-land cards and how they interact. You're not usually thinking about how your lands interact.
Right.
It's not that, like, the text on the cards is any less discoverable. It's that people commit very little time to thinking about their lands relative to non-lands.
Right. And when you're in a draft, you're being bombarded with a lot of information, a lot of questions and challenges all at once. So if you're drafting a new cube you've never played for the first time, it's not that if you looked at these 2 lands together and said, how do these interact? Sure, you would figure it out in 15, 30 seconds. But yeah, that's not where the attention is being focused. So
you're not spending 5 seconds staring at your lands and thinking, am I missing something here?
Right.
The last downside was a downside listed in Slothromp's post on Reddit. Maybe you have other downsides you can think of, Anthony. And this was a downside that I think is kind of what we touched on about how everything we said as a benefit can also be a downside. They basically said that, the presence of these fetch lands, they found overpowered a lot of things in their cube, like overpowered the Delve cards, the landfall cards, and made them too good.
Right.
And that's a very important thing to be able to recognize. I think so often players are just always trying to make their cube better. And we've talked so much about how that makes so little sense to make your cube better, right? You make your cube more powerful.
You can't make your cube better by making every single individual card better because
it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Right? So what you do by adding those fetch lands is you make some of the cards better, the cards that care about those things, and that means that every other card is a little worse, right? Because it's all relative. So if you play a bunch of fetch lands, you made Treasure Cruise better and you made Ponder worse. You just did. Well, actually, Ponder still works with fetch lands too. But
yeah, Ponder with fetch lands is actually great.
So you made Consider a little worse, right? And
well, with Consider, you can surveil to the top, and then if your opponent does something, you can then choose you actually do want to put on the bottom.
You made Boon of the Wishgiver worse. A little worse. That to me is that's cube design, right? Recognizing that everything you add has this balancing effect where it's going to make some things better, and that inherently makes other things worse because it's all relative. It's not like your, beloved green-white deck is untouched when you change your blue and black section. It changes the entire cube. It changes that deck's relationship to the other decks, and that same is true with adding these cards to your environment. So if any of those benefits we talked about are benefits that don't work for you for your environment, or you think these cards are balanced just right, you think the Treasure Cruise without fetch lands is the exact right power level for your environment, then that's a really good reason not to run them, because you are going to make Delve cards and Delirium cards a lot more powerful if you have a lot of fetch lands floating around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that thinking in those big terms about just how are you managing this relative power level and making everything make sense and play well and be fun together is really the essence of cube design for me.
Did we miss anything on fetch lands?
I'm sure we missed so much.
We're going to find out.
We're going to find out when you, dear listener, write in and tell us.
But we're out of time for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio, so if we did miss anything...
Oh, we didn't even talk about that the life loss from the classic iconic fetches can just be an upside in some cases. Maybe you want to play Death Shadow or do something else.
That's a core part of why Death Shadow works in the environments it works in. I would argue from a cube design perspective, it's an advantage for my goals because I don't like games going long.
As a designer,
I like games going short.
People, absolutely.
So I played triple shocks and double fetches, and yes, your mana base is really going to hurt in a 3 or 4 color deck. That's one of the ways I punish those decks.
Have you considered just saying starting life total is 10?
No.
Okay.
But like I said, we are out of time on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. So if we did forget something, let us know, and we'll I'm sure we'll return to this topic in one way or another at some point in the future, Anthony. It's inevitable. 22 weeks to CubeCon, Anthony.
It's too far away.
It's still a big number.
Can we just make that number smaller?
It's still a big number. I'm looking forward to tickets going on sale because once I bought my ticket, then I'm going to get my plane. I'm not willing to get a plane ticket. I just have my ticket. I want to get it all sort of sorted out. So I'm eagerly watching CubeCon on Twitter and following John of Cultic Cube and Gwen of Cube Cobra and J-Bro to make sure that I hear when those tickets drop. So you should come to CubeCon and play Cube with us and Caleb Gannon, apparently.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. I'm also really excited. So they took submissions for people to bring cubes that they're going to feature and organize draft around. So I think soon they're going to, I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but put those up and let the community vote on what cubes they want to see featured. So I'm really looking
forward
good
reason to pay attention, yeah.
to see what people submitted and what people want to play.
I was digging through Caleb's social media. He has a whole separate YouTube channel dedicated to his research work that has nothing to do with Magic. And on that channel, he has a picture of his face as his profile picture. This guy's super handsome. It's not fair that he's super handsome. It doesn't make any sense. He's this brilliant Magic player, this data scientist, makes all this great art, he's got this huge following as a content creator, and he's handsome?
Did you need that?
Too much. Pop down. And that brings us to the end of the episode. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by tapping some fetch lands, getting our non-basics with basic land types, and casting our spells.
I was wrecked by a different fetch in the last cube draft we did last week, which also ended up putting a lot of lands in the graveyard. My opponent crushed me with Bonded Fetch.
That's what we didn't touch. We didn't touch on Bonded Fetch, apparently.